Oh, thank you so much. My aim today is to kind of use my geriatric pharmacist lens to bring to you issues that are pertinent to the health of older adults, particularly brain health, and how that relates to medications. So, the way that I wanted to arrange the talk is to focus because medications affect all organ systems. Medications have really wide ranging effects. And I've only have an hour or less with you. So I really wanted to focus, and particularly because the area for the talk today is on brain health. So for the purposes of this talk, I want to use dementia and changes in cognition and memory as my definition of brain health. There are a variety of definitions in the literature that encompass pretty much all aspects of living and life, quality of life, in social, interpersonal interactions. And it's really fascinating and amazing and overwhelming. So I really wanted to focus on the probably the most areas of concern for folks in regards to medications is related to cognition and dementia. As I'm talking about medications, I will be referring to prescription medications, non-prescription medications, which are also called over-the-counter medications. These are the ones that you can purchase at the drugstore, and also include a little bit about supplements and herbal products. And the idea with my focus area is to help you determine how that you can minimize your risk of having cognitive changes or maintain healthy brain. So again, reiterating my goal for the session is that you will learn something more about medications that can affect your brain health, and that you can leave out of here with some actionable strategies on how to manage your medications and preserve and protect your brain health. So that's the goal. So I'm going to be focused really on some practical tips that you can use when you leave out of here. Okay, so let's start with something that's called potentially inappropriate medications in older adults. This potentially inappropriate term comes from a series of articles called the American Geriatric Society Beers Criteria. And what I'm going to share with you from the Beers Criteria today, I'll be referring to this as the Beers Criteria. That's how we teach it in pharmacy school. That's how my pharmacy colleagues refer to this. So I'll be calling this Beers Criteria. So jumping right in, let's talk about what's on the Beers Criteria and how some of those medications may be potentially inappropriate in older adults. So you'll notice that the most recent update is from last year. So this is the most current information that I'm sharing with you today. And you may be asking, why is it called the AGS Beers Criteria? Well, it was originally named after Dr. Mark Beers and his colleagues who were practicing at UCLA in the 90s. And when they first came up with this idea of having a list of medications, they really were hoping to come up with a list of medications that the harm of which outweighed the risk. I said that incorrectly. Let me correct myself. That the harms outweighed the benefits. So as with all medications, there are beneficial effects. These are the ones that generally are your desired. But every medication has some adverse effects too. So trying to balance those so that the benefits outweigh the risks. And so Dr. Beers and his colleagues came up with a list and in older adults in nursing homes, there's a list of medication where the harm outweighs the benefits. So let's put that together, and we're going to use that in caring for our patients who are in nursing homes. And it worked out really well. There was, some great experience gained from that. And so a handful of years later, they're like, let's expand this to all older adults, not just for people who are in nursing homes, because we want to make sure that everybody is, feeling the benefit of having this kind of list. Okay, so this is good for everybody. You'll note that Dr. Beers died in 2009. And the American Geriatric Society did not want this work to just kind of fade away. So they took over the stewardship of the Beers criteria, and it has since been the American Geriatrics Beers criteria, although we still use that shorthand notation of Beers criteria. And since the AGS took over Beers criteria, I think there have been 4 updates. So they update every handful of years through an iterative process, reviewing the literature, learning from new studies, learning from new case reports, and updating the list. So again, I'm presenting to you the most recent update of the Beers criteria. All right, so what is the intention of Beers criteria? Well, one of the big ones is to make sure that the harms are factored in. So ultimately, we want to make sure that an older adult's exposure, we want to reduce their exposure to potentially inappropriate medications, potentially harmful medications. The guide also serves as an education tool for clinicians and for patients. So I think I can share that with you after the talk. I can send the link out if you'd like to read it for yourself. So it's meant as an educational tool. And then also from people who do research in medication quality and safety, it can be a tool to help guide some research studies. For our purposes today, I think I want to focus on the first intention. So reducing older adults' exposure to potentially inappropriate medications. The other key thing about the Beers criteria is that it's intended for all older adults, 65 and older, across all settings. So recall it started primarily in the nursing home setting, but it has been since been expanded. And so now we're applying this to all care settings: hospital, nursing home, clinic, community. But these criteria do not apply to hospice and end-of-life care. So that's a great caveat. When we teach our students about Beers criteria, we are very intentional about taking care of somebody at the end of life. Many of the medications on Beers criteria are pretty much the standard in treating symptoms at the end of life. So when we're in that situation, the Beers criteria kind of just goes to the side. Okay. So Beers criteria is kind of a long article, and it's pretty much a compilation of 10 tables. Just lots of tables, and which makes it really challenging to memorize. But also it kind of summarizes all of the literature into a tabular form, so it's easier to navigate. I wanted to focus on 2 of the tables that are in Beers criteria. So there's one that's organized by organ system and therapeutic category. So there's one giant table that goes over pages in this article, and it starts by organ system and goes down by therapeutic category. It goes head to toe. So it goes from central nervous system, cardiovascular system, endocrine, gastrointestinal, and so it hits all of them. I didn't list them all on here because I really was focusing on the central nervous system for the purpose, but I wanted to give you a bigger sense for how encompassing the Beers criteria are in the tables. So there's one table that's organized by organ system and therapeutic category, and then there's another table that spans pages and pages that talks about diseases and syndromes. And in that one, again, it's still broken down by organ system, but it calls out particular conditions or diseases under each of those categories. So I've listed a few for you on the slide just to give you a flavor of what's included. So under central nervous system, there are one of the conditions is delirium. Then there's dementia and cognitive impairment, which will be a good focus of our talk today. History of fall or fracture, or Parkinson's disease. And then you can see on other organ systems some additional conditions that are included in the table. But again, keeping in line with the focus for this talk, we're going to focus primarily on the central nervous system. Okay? All right. So the next thing I want to do is, I know this is small, and I wanted to give you a snapshot of the table, just so you can see how it's laid out. And again, I'm happy to share the entire article with you afterwards if you want to get out your magnifying glass and pore over it. But in this one, there's on the headings for the table include disease or syndrome, drugs or drug classes that are important, a rationale, a recommendation from the panel who puts these guidelines together, and then it also includes quality of evidence and the strength of the recommendation. So within the central nervous or within dementia or cognitive impairment, there's 3 drug classes I wanted to focus on, and I put a red dot next to each one of them. These will be broken out in subsequent slides and put in larger font so you can see kind of what I'm talking about a little bit more easily than this. But really, this is how the Beers criteria look. It's giant tables with this kind of information. So my hope is to take this tiny, tiny little font, blow it up into bigger, and then talk about it in terms that are practical for you. Okay? So the areas that I wanted to talk about are anticholinergics, and I'll explain what that is in a subsequent slide. Benzodiazepines, which is a class or category of medications. And then this one's a mouthful. It's benzodiazepine receptor agonist hypnotics. But we usually call those Z drugs because that's way easier. And the reason we call it Z drugs is they are primarily sleep medications that have Z's in their names, like Zolpidem and Zalopon. And I will give you some additional information upcoming slides. So we're going to talk about 3 main categories under the delirium and dementia. And I just mentioned all of those things, but I made that bigger font for you to see there. So let's talk about anticholinergic medications first. Again, I wanted you to get a sense for how all-encompassing the tables are. And within anticholinergic medicines, there is a big, long list. And anticholinergic or medications with anticholinergic properties treat many conditions. They can be used as antidepressants, treating depression. They can be used to treat nausea and vomiting. They can be used for antihistamine properties like treating allergies. They can be used for urinary incontinence. Some of them can be used for Parkinson's symptoms. They can be used for gastrointestinal ailments, and they can be used as skeletal muscle relaxants. So again, this category of medications, pretty all-encompassing. Again, I'm going to pull out, I think, what's going to be pertinent and actionable for you to use. So why am I calling out anticholinergics? It was on the tabular slide. It says, hey, let's avoid using these. The strength of evidence is pretty good, and the quality of evidence is good, and the strength of recommendation is strong. So why is that? Well, we know from studies that the cumulative exposure to medications on this list is associated with an increased risk of falls, delirium, which is an acute change in cognition, and dementia, even in younger adults. So I'm going to say that again. Cumulative exposure to medications on this list is associated with increased risk of things that we want to avoid: falling, dementia, or delirium, which is an acute change in cognition. Okay. So that's the big reason we want to avoid that. Kind of more targeted, what's the issue with anticholinergics in general? I've got a cartoon here. It's let me back up. So some of the problems with anticholinergics, it affects multiple organ systems. It can cause confusion, which is how it relates to falls and cognition changes. It can cause dilated pupils, which may make your ability to see impaired. It can cause dry mouth, urinary retention, or constipation. So none of those things is desirable, which is why we want to avoid these medications in general if we can. When I was learning pharmacy, we learned sort of a memory aid about if you take too much anticholinergic, it makes you mad as a hatter, blind as a bat, dry as a bone. which is it. Yeah. And so you can kind of see that in the cartoon here, right? You get the Mad Hatter who is having some problems with seeing and memory and cognition. So that's one way. And then I hope you'll indulge me a different way of a memory aid of some of the challenges with anticholinergics. And that is can't see, can't spit, can't pee, can't poo, constipation. And so whenever I'm working through it, even to this day, even though I have been practicing pharmacy for decades, that still comes to my mind when I'm trying to remember what it is that we're worried about with anticholinergics. So again, these are really medications that you want to avoid if you can because of the falling risk, the confusion risk, the cumulative exposure, increasing the risk of delirium. All right, so here we go. How do you do that? Well, some of those medications on that list are prescription only. And then your prescriber can help kind of minimize those if they recognize that those medications have anticholinergic properties. But you may be surprised to learn that some of the medications on that list are available for purchase over the counter. So you can go to the drugstore today and you can buy medications that have these anticholinergic drugs in them. What kind of examples are we talking about? Benadryl. Benadryl. Everybody takes Benadryl. It's good for allergies. But diphenhydramine is a very strongly anticholinergic medication. Cause people to be sleepy, right? Sometimes it's used for allergies. Sometimes it's used as a sleep aid because it makes people really drowsy. Tylenol PM has diphenhydramine, the same active ingredient as Benadryl. And it's used as a sleep aid because it makes people drowsy. So that product has two active ingredients. This has Tylenol in it, and it has the active ingredient in Benadryl in it. So you think, oh, I'm just having a little trouble sleeping. I can take a couple of these medications. Certainly would help you sleep, but it does increase your risk of having some of those anticholinergic effects. And the way that sometimes plays out is people are groggy the next day, they trip and fall, or they have to get up in the middle of the night and they just can't get oriented. So it may help sleep, but it also can have a lag effect that it's called a hangover effect. So I'm wanting you to recognize that. So when you are thinking about going through your medication cabinet or helping somebody else go through their medication cabinet, try to take some of these things out as you can. All right, the list goes on. Nausea relief. This one has meclizine in it. Meclizine can also be used for vertigo as a prescription product, but meclizine it works to treat nausea, and you can go buy that today. Another sleep aid, Unizong, that has dimenhydrinate in it. Another medication that is on the Beers criteria. Motion sickness, right? You know about I'm totally blanking on the word. Help me out, Morgan. Dramamine, yes, thank you. ZQuil, more sleep aid. Dramamine, there's Dramamine, it was there. And NyQuil, cold and cough. Yeah, I saw some reactions out there. Yeah. So really, I think one of the important lessons to take away from this, or the message, is that you may be taking an anticholinergic medication without realizing it. And so I'm hoping that when you go home today, you can look in your medication cabinet, look at what you've got there, and then kind of decide whether you want to avoid taking it or, make good choices about your medications. So if we could please hold questions till the end for the recording, thank you. So the list I've got up here is not all inclusive. I just picked out some common ones, and then I filled up the slide as much as I thought was feasible. But there's more out there. And in general, medications with anticholinergic properties could be included in sleep aids, allergy relief medication, motion sickness or nausea medications, and some cough and cold. So the message, look at the product that you're purchasing so you can make good choices. How do you look? The great thing about OTC products is they're labeled in such a way that at the very top of the label, it says these are the active ingredients. So in here on the left-sided, that is a product that contains just diphenhydramine. It is a sleep aid for nighttime, and that's the same active ingredient as Benadryl. So it's right at the top of the drug facts. You can catch that. There are also, I think I showed you on the earlier one, Tylenol PM and the cough and cold product. They both have multiple ingredients. So they both contain the active ingredient in Tylenol, and then they both contain the active ingredient in Benadryl, but then the cough and cold one has a couple of additional medications to treat those other symptoms. And so unless you're vigilant, unless you look, you might be taking something, or you might accidentally expose yourself to something that you'd actually prefer to avoid. Okay, so message, check your over-the-counter medications so that you can kind of weed through and minimize your use or avoid using anything with anticholinergic properties. All right. So next, I'm going to talk about the next category, which is benzodiazepines. And the good news is these are prescription-only products. So you're not going to go to the drugstore and be able to purchase these without a prescription. So you don't have to be quite as vigilant about buying, symptom-related products in the pharmacy. And on the slide, I have a table. There are a lot of benzodiazepines, but I think maybe the ones that you might more commonly recognize are Xanax, Halcion, Restoril, Ativan. Those are all considered benzodiazepines. And why are we worried about benzodiazepines? So what we know from the review of the literature is that benzodiazepines are linked with physical dependence. So your body develops a dependence to these medications. And if you stop taking them suddenly, you can have some uncomfortable withdrawal symptoms. So your body kind of gets used to it. We know in older adults that as their bodies age, the sensitivity to certain medications heightens. So maybe the dose that somebody might took when they were 40 or 50 may be really too high for somebody 60, 70, 80 because of the changes in sensitivity as people age. We also know that the metabolism of older adults can slow down as they age too, and many of these drugs are depend on the body's natural metabolism to eliminate the drugs from the body. So if you continue to give a big dose in the setting of slower metabolism, the drugs can kind of hang out in your body longer. Okay, so those are some reasons why we're concerned. Kind of related to anticholinergics, we also know that older adults who take benzodiazepines have an increased risk of cognitive impairment, delirium, again, that's acute changes in cognition, falling, bone fractures, and motor vehicle crashes. So some of those are related to the desired effects of the medication. So they make you feel kind of relaxed, sometimes sleepy, sometimes drowsy. So you can imagine. And then sometimes benzodiazepines can give you that same hangover effect the next day. So if you take it one day, the effects may stick with you, feel dizzy, drowsy, can increase the risk of falling. The other thing that has kind of emerged in the last couple of years is that when benzodiazepines are used in combination with opioids for pain management, there's a really risk of profound sedation, profound sleepiness, respiratory depression, which means that your respiratory function is really kind of in a worrisome state. Sometimes people can stop breathing because of that combination, coma and death. So benzodiazepines alone are concerning in that they cause all of the effects I mentioned: falls, fractures, motor vehicle crashes, dementia. And then when they're used with opioids, it adds on some additional concerning effects. So we really are vigilant about identifying folks who have prescription for benzodiazepines so we can work with work with them to kind of taper them off. Now, benzodiazepines, because they can cause physical dependence, shouldn't be just stopped cold turkey. They should be tapered over time and under the supervision of a medical provider to minimize the discomfort of withdrawal symptoms. Okay? I've got these summarized in an upcoming slide. All right. Let's switch over to the Z drugs, since that was the third main category I wanted to talk about. And these are the drugs that are generally used for sleep. You would probably recognize them for their lovely advertisements on TV, right? The butterfly floating in the wonderful night of sleep. Yes, I want that. So Lunesta, Sonata, Ambien, those are the medications that are grouped in here. One thing that we learned from the clinical studies is that, it can improve some sleep, but it's really not that significant. I think it's like just in the order of minutes. So you can go to sleep a few minutes faster than if you didn't take it, and you might sleep a few minutes longer than if you hadn't taken it, but it doesn't automatically guarantee you 8 hours of fully rested night sleep. So comparing it to people who continue to have insomnia, these medications are enough to give you a little bit more, but it's really not as great as the advertisements make it look. Why are we concerned about the Z drugs? Because the risks are very similar to benzodiazepines. So they kind of interact with the same receptors in the brain. So delirium, falls, fractures, increased emergency room visits and hospitalizations and motor vehicle crashes, right? Nobody wants any of those things to happen. So really my message for today is that these medications, even though they've got really great ads on TV, can really be detrimental to your brain health. All right, so you may be asking, what should I do if I'm taking, or my loved one is taking, something that's on the Beers list, whether it's a benzodiazepine, a Z drug, or one that's on the anticholinergics? And again, there's a whole bunch of other drugs we're not even talking about today. Again, we're just focusing on the central nervous system active ones. So what should you do if you see that? First of all, it's great that you're recognizing that, and there are things that you can do. But please don't take any action on your own without consulting a healthcare provider first. Your prescriber, the pharmacist, they can advise you in a way to kind of more safely, stop taking it, minimize its use, offer alternatives so that you can, manage whatever condition you're trying to manage, but in a safer way. So please don't do anything on your own. People can get into trouble if they try to self-manage their own medications, especially the ones that can cause some withdrawal symptoms. The other piece that you can start working on your own is to visit the Canadian Medication Appropriateness Deprescribing Network, and they have a really great website. It's called deprescribing.org. And this is a group of healthcare providers, researchers, scientists in Canada who put together some really helpful guides for you to learn more about how to recognize medications that may be harmful, how to go about talking to your healthcare provider about things that you're concerned about. And on the screenshot here, some of the things that they have intended for consumers is questions like, am I taking too many medications? What is deprescribing? And I'll just tell you, deprescribing is a way of optimizing your medication. So either reducing the dose or discontinuing your medications as you age, as to become more safe for you. So deprescribing is a way of reducing doses, eliminating, minimizing, so for optimal medication management. There's also some help on medications in falls, medications in memory, sleeping well, additional things you can do, and there's some brochures and some nice things and some testimonials that's on their site. So you can visit that I can share some articles with you that could be posted on the website Okay. Yeah, so we'll get that on the website. All right. So identified this or you're worried about it, you want a little bit more assistance, more help. How can you advocate either for yourself or a loved one? You can talk to your provider for a full medication review. And the idea is to like scrutinize each medication on the list. And then you can ask your provider, hey, what about deprescribing? And again, I've got a more formal definition here, which is stopping or reducing harmful medications that may no longer be necessary or could be causing harm. And these are some of the questions that you can ask your provider or your pharmacist specifically about your medications. And this information is also included in the guidances that are from the Canadian Deprescribing Network. So 5 important questions. Why am I taking this medication? What are the potential benefits and harms? Can it affect my memory or cause me to fall? Can I stop or reduce the dose? And who do I follow up with and when? So as pharmacists, I think this is a great practice for every medication. I think for the purpose of this talk, we're focusing primarily on the ones that affect memory and cognition. But really, again, because medication harms come in all flavors and varieties, these are really good tips to handle across all medication classes for anybody. All right, moving along. So I talked about some non-prescription medications over the counter. I talked about some prescription medications. I think some of you may be wondering, well, what about all the supplements I see advertised, those brain health supplements? What about those? So let's talk about that for a minute. And I want to offer a special acknowledgement to Morgan Hogue, who is a PharmD candidate. She's going to graduate in a few months. And I am presenting her work that she's compiled for this talk. And if you want to, I know I'm going to embarrass you. She's sitting right here. So part of her project working with me for this month was to compile and prepare some information to share with you about supplements. Okay, so what are brain supplements? They're advertised, they're everywhere, right? They're over-the-counter products that are marketed to improve concentration, focus, memory, or to protect from cognitive decline, right? So you need to be on the supplement. You need to protect your brain health. Now, one thing we wanted you to know is that the products that are sold as supplements and even over the counter are not regulated by the FDA. So prescription products undergo a very thorough review for effectiveness and safety. And companies who want to market a drug have a pretty high bar to get approval by the FDA. So we can feel some assurance that we know what to expect when we're using prescription medications. Supplements, on the other hand, do not have that same kind of review process. So in essence, if Morgan and I wanted to go into business, we could take leaf cuttings, grass trimmings, put them in the capsule and sell those as a brain supplement, and nobody would say anything about it. Now, we're not going to do that because that's unethical, but just by way of an example. So really the message is you don't always know what's in the supplements. And there have been studies looked at a wide range of supplements, actually testing to see what was in there. And it doesn't always match up with what's on the label. And sometimes there's harmful stuff in there that you don't want in your body. So as a word of caution, in general, just know that supplements exist. We can't be assured of their effectiveness. We can't be assured of their safety, and we can't be assured of what's actually in them. Common brain supplements that we're using for brain health include these ingredients. Now, in Morgan's review, she ran across like dozens, right? And these are the ones that came up most commonly. Ginkgo biloba, some vitamins, caffeine, carnitine, ashwagandha, turmeric, and choline. So there's a lot out there. Again, just to reiterate the message, we're not entirely certain how well they work, how safe they are, and what's actually that you're buying is actually inside the product. But there is some good news. You can see the seal on the right. It's called the USP verified seal. And when you see a product over the counter that you're buying with that seal on it, that indicates that that product has actually undergone independent testing, and you can feel more confident about what's in that product. You'll probably see the seal more on the vitamins than you will on some of the other supplements. So, like when I buy my vitamin supplements, either for myself or my kids, I look for that seal because that offers me some assurance that what's on the label is actually in the product that I'm buying. But again, a lot of the brain supplements are likely not going to have that on their label. So just a word of caution. So based on the review of what of some of the memory supplements that you can buy, really, there's not a lot of research. The results can be really mixed. Sometimes the results are not significant. So there may be some studies, but certainly not to the extent with prescription products. They're just not as much literature or data to support their use. Because these products have many different ingredients, and sometimes products will have multiple ingredients in them, it's really hard to tease out which ones might be doing the thing that's beneficial or not. Sometimes it's just hard to interpret the literature because of some of the variability in the type of studies. And lastly, the methods by which some of these studies measure brain function and memory are kind of varied. So it's hard to compare across. So again, it's just kind of a word of caution that's just really hard to tell. It would really be great if I could stand up here and say, this one is going to work and you can count on that. But at this point, I cannot say that. I cannot say that. A special word about Prevagen, because I think that one gets a lot of airtime. Yeah, and that one's the one. It's the newest one anyway. So just to summarize some of the data that comes out of the studies is there's one study that showed some improvement in verbal learning and recall. That's what we got, verbal learning and recall. So does that really help with brain health? Does it really help with cognition? Does it really help with avoiding dementia or some of those things? We can't really say. I guess on the positive side, people who took Prevagen had a really, really small incidence of side effects. So not a lot of people experience side effects. And then the side effects that they did experience, they're kind of similar to many of the side effects for most medications, right? Nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, headache. So who's to say whether that was actually the medication or just something that was happening to the person that day? Interestingly, and I didn't realize this until Morgan kind of did this deep dive, is that the main ingredient in Prevagen is derived from jellyfish. So, and so some of the ideas that, well, it maybe increases calcium levels in the brain. At the same time, when you take a product orally, we're not certain if it can get into your bloodstream and travel to the brain where it can have that effect. So we really don't know. Lastly, with Prevagen, we've included a screenshot of Amazon pricing, and a 60 capsules, which is 1 month supply, 2 month supply, can run you $99. So it can be quite costly with, to my view, limited or unclear benefit. So kind of summarizing, like, it might not hurt, it probably won't help, and it's kind of expensive. But if it helps you and you feel better about it and you can afford it, I can't tell you don't do it, but I wouldn't choose this for myself or my family because I don't feel convinced, and it's pretty costly. One other additional word on supplements is some of them do have drug interactions with prescription medication. So if you choose to take a product like a supplement, please make sure that your healthcare team knows about that. There are some well-known effects of supplements that can really mess up your prescription medications. Okay. So to my knowledge, we don't have a lot of um, information about the brain supplements, but there are other ones like echinacea, feverfew that are used for different conditions that actually have well-known, recognized interactions with medications. So like giving you the blanket statement, you don't know for certain, so just be cautious and talk to your pharmacist or your healthcare provider if you choose to take supplements. Okay. All right. One last thing I wanted to leave you with. So I think we spent the first portion of this talk with me telling you, don't do this, avoid this, stop doing this. I do want to leave you on sort of a positive note of, yeah, there are some things that you may already be doing, and I want to applaud you for that and ask you to keep doing that. And so I wanted to share with you some new information that just came out this summer. It's published in The Lancet. And The Lancet, it's a UK medical publication. It's a medical journal in the UK, in the United Kingdom. And they have a dementia task force. And they comb the literature and offer updates similar to Beers criteria. And the most recent update was from this summer. And the takeaway message for you is that 50, 40-ish percent, 45% of dementia can be reduced. The risk factors can be reduced. And the graphic on the right-hand side shows kind of the lifespan and sort of the sinuous, nice graphic. And some of the things I want to highlight for you is that in early life, less education is a risk factor for dementia later in life. So good, send your kids to school, challenge them. In midlife, there's a handful of things that can increase the risk of dementia. So for example, hearing loss, depression, high cholesterol, traumatic brain injury, physical inactivity, diabetes, smoking, high blood pressure, obesity, and excessive alcohol. If you avoid those things or manage those conditions well, you can reduce your risk of dementias. So managing your diabetes, making sure your blood pressure is under control, managing your cholesterol, avoiding smoking, avoiding excessive alcohol. So those are things that you can do. And then those are really much aligned with cardiovascular disease too, right? If you go to your doctor and they're like, okay, you have a high blood pressure and high cholesterol, like make sure you stop smoking and get some exercise and sleep well, right? So it's really similar. Some of the risk factors that occur later in life that you can be aware of and actually take action on is social isolation. So we learned, I think we already knew, but it was really magnified during the pandemic times that older people with dementia had an accelerated progression of their dementia because of so much social isolation. And so that's why folks who live in, like congregate housing with older adults, they have activities and they want to make sure people get engaged and interact with each other and get out and do talks like this. This is great. Yeah. So social isolation is also a risk factor, and air pollution and hearing and vision loss. So you'll note that on this, some of the things we kind of already were kind of familiar with in terms of managing other chronic conditions, but new for dementia are added are cholesterol and visual loss. So I think one of my messages through this slide is that you may already be doing many of these things, and that's great, and keep doing them. There may be things that you might want to work a little bit more on, like getting a little bit more exercise or visiting, the audiologist and getting your hearing aids checked, or going to the optometrist and having your eyes checked more frequently, because those are all things you can do to help minimize the risk of dementia. And then you're like, well, aren't you here to talk about medications? And yes, I am. So let me tie that together for you. So many of those conditions I mentioned on the prior slide can be managed with medications. So we've got medications to manage cholesterol and diabetes and depression, high blood pressure, obesity. And we don't have medications for smoking, but we do have medications to help people stop smoking if they want to do that approach. So there's a lot of ways that we can use medications to reduce the risk of dementia by managing these chronic conditions. And again, if you're already doing those things, keep doing them. Congratulations. Keep at it. I think my last message on this slide is that managing chronic conditions can be really challenging. You may have multiple medications. There may be aspects of the regimen that are just hard to keep track of. And so I wanted to offer that adherence to that regimen ensures the best outcome. So making sure that you take things as prescribed gives you the best outcome. We also recognize that sometimes adhering to your prescribed medication regimen can be challenging. And so if you're having particular challenges, I as a pharmacist would welcome you to talk to me and come up with a plan on how to manage any areas that you may be having trouble adhering to your regimen and your prescriber as well. So what are some factors that may affect medication adherence? Well, for some people, it's the cost. It's really expensive, some of the medications. And so I'll tell you in my own experience, you come up with a great treatment plan, you send the patient on their way, and then they don't pick up the prescription because it costs too much. And then later it's like, the regimen is not working. What can we do differently? Only to learn that, wow, that was really expensive and we should come up with a different plan. Okay, so cost, sometimes forgetting. So there are ways that we can build into our system to not forget. For myself, I set I set alarms on my phone so I can remember certain of my medications I need to take. There may be some things related to being able to communicate well with your provider. There may be some people who may not fully understand the purpose or the logistics of a regimen. So can you imagine if you're on insulin and you have to check your blood sugar 4 times a day and give yourself, an injection before meals and at bedtime, it becomes really overwhelming. So, right, really just acknowledging that if anybody's having any problems, that, there are ways we can work around. Sometimes, though, people will have particular beliefs about medications or their condition that need to be discussed in order to have the best outcome. So I know, there may be some, people who just prefer not to take any kind of medications. And okay, let's work with that. Versus people may want to take certain kind of medications, but not other. Well, so we'll work with that. So the idea is to find a plan that helps you or your loved one adhere to the regimen as best they can so they can get the best outcome in terms of preventing dementia. Okay. Lastly, I just wanted to briefly mention, I don't have a slide for this. I was browsing through the website of prior, and you may be out there thinking, well, aren't you going to talk about the medications that are used to treat dementia? And there have been a couple of talks earlier in this series who've done a very detailed, in-depth job. So I would refer you to those talks because they do a really great in-depth job that I wouldn't have time to go into today. So I just want to acknowledge that there is that piece that I didn't cover today, but it is covered elsewhere in the series. All right. So in summary, here's your list of do's and don'ts, how to make smart medication choices. So start or continue looking after those modifiable risk factors, managing your chronic conditions, adhering to your medication regimen, asking questions about your medications. Do I still need to take this? What kind of side effects does this have? Does this affect my memory? Those kind of questions. When you are working with your healthcare team, let them know all of the products you're taking. So as pharmacists, we're trained to ask about prescription, non-prescription supplements, vitamins, but not all of the providers that you might interact with are. So I encourage you to share that even if they don't ask. If you're going to use a supplement, look for one that has the USP seal on it to ensure the best product. And then also read the label of the over-the-counter products so you can avoid taking something that could have a negative effect on your brain health. And then lastly, thinking about medications on the Beers criteria, avoiding, minimizing those. And these are the questions that you can ask your provider. Are any of my medications on the Beers criteria? Can I stop taking them? What's the best way to stop taking them? So that would be my advice. Avoiding medications with anticholinergic properties. Again, talking to your provider, pharmacist, they can help you identify which medications may be anticholinergic. Avoid or limit the use of medications that make you sleepy, particularly benzos and Z drugs. And then lastly, don't change your medications on your own without talking to a healthcare provider first. All right. So thank you so much all for your attention. Appreciate you coming out this afternoon to hear this talk. My hope is that you have some action items you can put into place when you go home, when you're looking in your own medication cabinet, or you're looking out after your friend or another family member. And I think at this time I will close and open up for questions.